President-elect Donald Trump President Donald Trump has been sworn in as the 47th president of the United States. Now in his second term, how will his second presidency affect Louisianans? I talked with two Sinloa state legislators to answer that question.
We will have increased enthusiasm because we know we won't be facing opposition from Washington for things that we'll do.
That's Sinloa State Representative Chuck Owen, a Republican legislator whose party has taken control of the Louisiana legislature in the House and Senate and currently holds a slim majority in the U.S. Congress. In 2024, Republican Governor Jeff Landry was sworn in as Louisiana governor, succeeding former Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards, and Louisianans saw things the legislature was not able to do previously.
The majority in my first 4 years was, I would say, less solid, and then we had consternation with the governor's office. We don't have that anymore. We were able to get a lot more things done last year, both in the regular session and in the special session in the fall with the taxes.
And while President Trump is in office, State Rep Owen wants to see a stronger military.
We need a larger army. We need a larger Air Force. And that's one of the things I'm hopeful that President Trump and Secretary Hegseth will pursue. We'll be growing our army. And I think that would be good for the country. It might be good for us in central Louisiana. But we need a bigger military.
However, for Democrats in the state legislature, a second Trump presidency does raise concerns.
The president was sworn in on this Monday. I want to congratulate him, and I hope that he does an excellent job because he's the president for everybody. I'm mostly concerned with the economy.
Sinloa State Representative Ed Larvadain III says President Trump's proposed tariffs would make a lot of items very expensive, and folks here locally will be struggling to pay for it.
Everyday items like food, automobile parts, those items will be expensive. Also, those countries may retaliate and also place tariffs on our items. I'm concerned about that.
Adding to those concerns is making sure ports in the Pelican State stay active, including Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Taking a look at the numbers, President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance won 60% of the vote in the Pelican State from the November election. Currently, U.S. Congress holds a slim GOP majority. 218 Republicans, 215 Democrats, and 2 vacancies make up the House of Representatives. In the Senate, there are 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents. And in the Louisiana legislature, State House and State Senate Republicans also hold a majority. But overall, finding common ground will be key for all.
We're in this together. President Trump will be here for 4 years. We have to find common ground. On issues that we can't work with him, we're going to work with him.
This would be a year for great governance, and that's what I'm hoping for, is that Democrats and Republicans and independents can work together and govern well this year. Let's try to plan for the future, put the fighting of election year aside, and let's try to plan for the future for our children and grandchildren. That's what I'm hoping for.
Pending any special sessions in the near future, the state legislature will convene for its regular session on Monday, April 14th at noon.